Thank you. And what we wanted to be able to do is use this as an opportunity to have some of the key messages from each of our panelists, the way to from here, and of course how they see the future shaping up. So I might begin with Steve again. Steve, in your role to be able to, I guess we've had a bit of summing up from Matthias, but in your context to pick up on the key messages and I guess how you see us move this along in the future.
I think, really from our perspective in New South Wales is we're trying to have a very progressive agenda in resource recovery and sustainable material use. So, we're injecting a fair amount of money into infrastructure in New South Wales, $250 million. So I have another part of my business, regulation, but also program development work. So it's got a couple of limbs to it, really. One is about community engagement. It's the one we often leave out, but they're the key players in the whole process. If we don't bring the community along with this discussion, I think usually at these workshops and conferences we all agree with ourselves, but how do we have a more outward-facing perspective on this, where we can bring the community along with this debate about, we might have to change the type of products we have, or what does recyclability mean, and how do I participate in that system? So we need to think about how we're going to bring the community along. For us, it's about infrastructure, and how do we position ourselves in a market that's increasingly becoming more globalised. We've seen quite severe or quite dramatic volatility in commodity prices recently. So when oil prices dip, plastic prices also dip. When you see metal dip, iron ore prices dip, the scrap metal price dips. So that starts to then affect the economics of this. So how do you build a system that's a bit more resilient to the shocks of any global changes? And why that's important is having a cash flow behind you that's predictable and sustainable means that you can build infrastructure. And then for us, it's a regulatory environment to make sure we have two dualling bits of legislation in New South Wales. When I mean dualling in a good way, we've got the Protection of the Environment Operations Act, which is about environment protection and human health protection. But we also got Waste Avoidance and Resource Recovery Act, which is about promoting resource recovery. And often when you're in the cutting edge area of recovering resources, the science might be quite settled. And so how do you set rules and regulations to ensure that whatever we're putting back into the productive economy is safe from a consumer perspective and an environmental perspective, but we're not being so onerous to stifle innovation. And so for that one, I really say, come and talk to the EPA early. We need to have a discussion and we need to tap into the good science we know that's out there. And then finally, it's about monitoring and reporting. How do we know that the change that we've actually have advocated for has had the effect that we want? And that's an important thing we need to measure. But it's also then to give ourselves credibility, which hasn't existed in the past, where we can go back to government and the community and say, we said we do this, we actually delivered on this. And once you get that credibility, and particularly in the consumer's eyes, I think we'll have a more sustainable framework.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve. Tristram.
Look, following on from that, I think what we're looking at is how we change our economy, and that's not too dissimilar to how we change businesses. It's just collectivised. And when you're looking at a business, you're looking at the business model and how agile that is and how scalable it is. And what we're looking at here is how do we scale up new technologies? How do we introduce disruptive technologies? And the equation really is one between sort of policy, the economy, and innovation. If you look at the most successful, rapidly growing businesses, they do it two ways, one through mergers and acquisition and the other through strategic partnerships. And I'd say in the context of what we're talking about today, strategic partnerships is part of the key. So those are partnerships between research, between industries, both singular and collective, so companies and industry as a whole. Government is a player. The enablers, which I call them enablers. The recyclers are the enablers, but at the end of the day, there's got to be generators and users that benefit from it. Often, when you come to these conferences, there's a lot of enablers and a few large generators and users, and you've got to get that message out to the community. I think that's if you want to see a big change, there's got to be a ubiquitous acceptance across the broad community. That comes back down to things like sort of design for deconstruction. So that may not suit an enabler because it may take recyclers out of the cycle at some point, particularly if it's being deconstructed for reuse rather than recycling. But there is a process of making it cheaper and easier to recycle as opposed to making it expensive and difficult. The community sort of sees values in that, and they will shop with those values if the messages are right. The other point for me, I suppose, is the sometimes it's seen as a, you know, is it in terms of government policy, is it an industry or is it an environment? And I think it's not a one or the other. And if it's not both, you miss a whole lot of policy agendas. So yes, there is, if you take it just as an environment policy, and no disrespect to those from the environmental departments and portfolios, they have a role, quite a significant role. And if you look at a lot of the recycling, it's evolved out of waste stream management, which is coming from one angle. But if you go to business, and I spent most of my life in the private sector, the first time anyone mentions environment, you go, will it bring me customer loyalty? That's revenue. Otherwise, it's a cost and a compliance regulatory issue that I need to deal with, and you know, collectively, when you're sitting around the pub rampaging against a policy environment, you'll call it red tape. How do you reduce that, and how do you shift the onus from, sorry, not the onus, how do you shift the view of industry from it being red tape and a cost to being an opportunity, an advantage, and particularly an opportunity to gain one over your competitors if you can introduce the disruptive technology. So I think it's part of that strategic partnership is actually between portfolios of policy. It's not one or the other, it's got to be both. And it's got to really focus on where that fits in the economy. The other thing I'd say is that in terms of, often we get excited about what we think needs to happen, and policy is a long game. It zigzags a lot. As long as you're constantly moving to the end game, that's a good thing, but often we sort of get excited about we're not getting there fast enough. That again comes back to the strategic partnerships question. Is the communication being broadly spread through the community? Is it being sort of divided and partisan within the industry? Is industry looking at policy perspectives from a long-term perspective? Because the reality is it will always take time to get there. I'll just finish up with one of my bugbears, which I mentioned earlier, which is the generators and users. If we want industry and the community as part of the progress, they need to be fully engaged and present more broadly in these sorts of activities and these sorts of conferences. If it's just the enablers, you're not getting your message out, you're not connecting with those that you need to have in here.
Thanks, Tristram.
Thanks, Tristram. Some points well made. When I told my board that I was coming to this conference and I was coming for 3 whole days, they thought I was going a bit mad. I have to go to conferences all over the world, and I spent a lot of money doing it. But I explained to them that we have a crisis of innovation and collaboration in our industry. We've seen some wonderful examples at this conference of the sort of outcomes that collaboration and innovation can deliver, but I think we're really only scratching the surface in terms of the opportunity. I represent a whole range of companies that are desperate for innovation. I look around this room and I see a brains trust, a potential brains trust if it's well directed. Some of the things I picked up moving around the conference, we had some excellent sessions on metals, but the 2 biggest issues facing the metals industry weren't part of the research agenda that folks have been following, and that's just a problem of asymmetric information. People don't know what they don't know. Issue 1, shredder flock. If someone can come up with a solution to that, probably Steve Beaman and myself will donate a kidney each. But it is a huge prize potentially commercially, and a huge prize in terms of linkage grants and all the KPIs that universities have. The other one is cash for scrap, organised crime, even the size of the metals industry. I heard here at this conference it was $2 billion. The ABS says it's $2.4 billion. It's way more than that. The entire industry runs on cash, and that has a whole bunch of perverse outcomes to the extent that international security agencies are getting involved and paying a lot of attention to it. The question then becomes, how do we fix it? How do we get better collaboration and better innovation? How do we have a scalable template for that? How do we create a space for that? So literally during this conference, I got into my office and said, can you do a quick redo of and create a new class of membership on our little application for my website for NGOs? So that there's a space for that. It has to be an online space. Everyone's busy. And it has to be a space that is secure. So I need to do code of conduct things, etc., about the information that's shared. But it is a space where, for a very low entry fee, an NGO level of entry, organisations such as universities can understand, by way of news feeds and Q&As, what industry really needs by way of research, and what industry, quite frankly, would be very willing to fund if they think there's some prospect, and putting people in contact with the people they need to be put in contact with there. Then people are on a high-grade drip. Then all these multinational companies with budgets to match can have direct issues solved, great policy outcomes for government, great policy outcomes for the community, and great policy outcomes for the innovation and research community.
Thank you. I've got five quick points to make. Some of them are takeaways for myself. Some of them I hope you might as well. The first one was a bit of maybe just a realisation for me, was that materials efficiency is the big opportunity even compared to energy efficiency. We heard some data from the German Department of Environment and Sustainability Victoria that while energy efficiency might save you a few percent, materials efficiency, materials are a much bigger cost to your business. So that's number one. Number two was, I guess we're all here interested in recycling and what can we do with waste, but some comments in some of the forums earlier in the week made me think that really there's more chance of a commercial solution if it's driven by the end product. So it's like a steelmaker saying, well, we need a material to foam our slags. What are some alternatives? And so it's easier I think we need to get more knowledge of the end products and then look for materials for that rather than start with our waste and think, well, where can that go? I think that's a tough sell. The other one was to emphasise what Marcus Reuter said, is that we need metallurgical knowledge to do this. It's not, you can't beat the laws of physics. So, if we're going to come up with creative ideas on how to reprocess waste into new materials, we need to invest the time to understand the metallurgy. And another one I think is that recycling and the circular economy is not something we're going to sort of mandate. To me, it's an emergent property of decisions we all make. So I think one day, hopefully, we'll find that lots of companies and organisations have made different decisions about where they get their material from and where they send their waste products, and we'll look back and go, wow, we've got a circular economy. So we can't wait around for it to happen. We've got to make it happen. And that's my last point, is I think that we obviously need to make different decisions, we can, but we also need to make different decisions. And all of us can do that, whether we're a consumer. If you're buying a car or building a house, you can ask the question, where did the materials for this come from? Unless as consumers we ask that question, nothing's going to change. And then when you're in a company and you influence purchasing decisions, you can say, well, do we need to get that material from the natural source that we always have, or can we put a bit of effort in to find an alternative source? So just emphasise we all have an obligation to make different decisions in whatever role we play in the community.
Thanks, Mark. Dan?
My two takeaways today from the sessions I attended, I think, were passion and collaboration. I think by nature I see researchers as always being very passionate about what they're doing and about changing the world and inventing new things. What I liked today was the industry contributors. You could see that they were passionate people. Paul, John, Steve from Brickworks. You need to identify those passionate people in industry that will help drive these projects and initiatives, because I think as John touched on, there's always going to be reasons why you can't do things, and it's a difficult environment, and there's always reasons why something could get too hard. So to identify those passionate people that can help drive these projects in industry, I think is very important. And the collaboration, so how we get more collaboration between research and industry, how we can embed students in industry, what schemes we can use and take advantage of and develop to get that industrial experience into the research field. I mean, from our personal experience in OneSteel, we've really benefited and seen a lot of value in the relationship we have with the university, and by that exchange and just being together, building trust, building those relationships, and out of that you can have the conversations where you can move things and overcome some of those hurdles that other people might put in front of you.
Thanks, Dan. And Ian?
I guess business has a mentality around business as usual. So we tend to stay with what we know. We're reluctant to change. We only change because maybe the competitors have changed. But nonetheless, I think change is certainly inevitable. We've had, as Dan said, a very successful relationship with the University of New South Wales, but that's been over 10 years, and I think industry has to move faster. I think we have to understand the new business models. From what I saw today, there's lots of good stuff going on, lots of really innovative ideas, thoughts, lots of work, but I see the business models are not fully developed or understood. So I think it's really understanding how business can take some of the opportunities and actually create new business models, create new platforms, create new commercial outcomes, and going forward. To do that, we have to understand what sits underneath, and that's some of that core technology, and understand where it's going, and how do you move from a primary resource material, as in the traditional mining concepts, to this recycling circular environment, where you are changing your supply chain, you are changing your business models to tap into greater resources.
Thank you.